Today's episode challenges a basic assumption that nature is free until it's gone. Across the Indo-Pacific, functioning ecosystems underpin water security, productivity, resilience, and even national stability. But until recently, nature's value hasn't shown up in the boardroom, on a balance sheet, or in procurement planning. Well, that's changing. Our guest is Dr. Tony O'Grady, a senior principal research scientist with CSIRO. His work in natural capital accounting is helping governments and industries transform ecosystems into strategic inputs, making it possible to measure, monitor and manage nature like we do with all other forms of capital. In this episode, we explore how leaders across sectors from agribusiness to defence can better value nature, reduce risk and unlock competitive advantage by treating ecosystems not just as scenery, but as infrastructure. Dr. Tony O'Grady, thank you for joining us on the CSIRO Intelligence Optimised podcast. How are you today, mate?
Very well, thanks, Todd. How are you?
All the better for speaking with you. I know how busy you are as a world-leading famous scientist solving the world's problems, so I really appreciate your time.
Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity to have a chat about all things natural capital.
Oh, mate, it's intriguing because I know nothing about natural capital, but I've been listening to you talk about it for a long time and it actually gets me excited. But I also just want to throw in here, just for our listeners, a bit of a disclaimer that we're family. You can't choose your family. You're stuck with me. I apologise for that.
Oh, that's both ways, doesn't it?
So, Tony, mate, can you just give us a quick overview of your work and the kinds of challenges that your team is addressing?
As you know, I work with CSIRO Environment down here in Hobart. And, you know, for much of the last decade, I've been championing this concept of natural capital. And we hear a lot about climate change and nature loss, and natural capital is really just a concept that we're using to start to integrate across a whole range of fields around climate, nature, etc., and help people understand the types of consequences that's going to have, not just for society more broadly, but for organizations in particular. So you must have heard the big stats out there, and I thought we're living through the world's sixth major extinction event, or, you know, the climate's likely to change into the future and things like that. And they're quite big, hairy topics that people struggle to get their heads around. A lot of what we do here in CSIRO is actually try to cut through a lot of that confusion and really get to the heart of what the problem is here. And in many ways, it's what we're doing currently is fundamentally affecting the sort of systems that we all rely on. We often think about, you know, extinction and things like that. We think it's about koalas going extinct or Sumatran tigers and things like that, but it's a much more fundamental problem than that, right? The loss of nature and, you know, climate change is a big driver of that, but there are five big drivers of fundamentally affecting those processes that we rely on. So what we try to do is really start to untangle these webs and get to the core of the problem, and then start to think about what risk does that pose and how do we start to address those risks and start to think about what are the strategies society and organisations more broadly can start to implement to address this challenge.
That's really important work, mate, because there are a lot of believers and naysayers, and when you say climate change, I guess you think, well, climate's been changing since day dot. It's obviously, though, becoming evident that, like you said, if oxygen's decreasing, due to whether it's the volume of water or volume of trees or whatever it is that's actually affecting that, that's a big problem for everyone, not just for leaders and for business, but for everyone, right?
And you've touched on a really important point there. Okay, climate has changed historically, but human civilizations have evolved in basically over the last 10,000 years in a period where the climate has been really stable. And so we've developed our cities and our agricultural and all our manufacturing capabilities in a period of history, geological history, that has been incredibly stable. But an outcome of that is that we are fundamentally changing that system and increasing the volatility and increasing the capacity of the earth to maintain that stability. And so it actually creates a genuine risk for society that I'm not sure that people fully get or fully comprehend on a sort of day-to-day basis.
But mate, can you just tell me, what does natural capital accounting actually mean in practice? And why is it gaining traction across government, finance and infrastructure sectors?
So the whole concept of natural capital accounting and natural capital assessment, it's just a really rigorous and structured way to think about, well, if nature is providing these services for us, so the capacity to maintain climates, the capacity to produce clean water, the pollination services that feed us, right? Natural capital accounting and assessment is just a straightforward process to actually value those services. So to think about, well, what's the contribution of those services to our production systems? And then flowing from that, what are the impacts that we're having on nature? What are they likely to do to those services? And can we value those impacts? And conversely, if we're dependent on some of these services, what's the value of that contribution to your business, Todd? How do you take that consideration in against all the other inputs into your business and start to think about it as a contribution to your actual revenues and things, your
To the
your
P&L
own.
and the...
Yeah, exactly. So a lot of what we're doing is actually thinking about, well, how do we put nature onto the balance sheet? What does an environmental profit and loss statement look like? Look like. So that's the accounting side of things, right? So can we adapt existing financial accounting approaches and start to implement and basically extend those concepts to include nature more broadly as an asset class on your balance sheet? And that gives you the capacity then to really be quite explicit around what's the value of the assets that you have under management, what's the value of the contributions that those assets are making to your business, and what's the value of the risks associated with loss of those contributions into the future. So it's really trying to connect the dot between, physical nature and the financial implications for governments and organisations more broadly.
And would it be fair to say it's not that foreign given, I guess, the rise of carbon accounting over the last 10 years especially?
No, it's been around for a long time. The term natural capital was first used in the 70s. Okay, environmental economists have been doing valuations of ecosystem services for many years. So it's not necessarily a new concept. It's 30, 40 years old already, right? But it is new in the way that people are starting to understand, well, this ongoing loss of nature or climate change are creating genuinely material risk that we need to start to incorporate into our decision making. And so how do we do that? One way of doing that is to actually utilize the tools that you already have at your disposal. So you sort of management accounts and your disclosure accounts, and start to bring that more broadly into your thinking. So,
And it's obviously really important that we value our ecosystem. So why is it no longer enough just to see nature as a backdrop? And what shifts when we treat ecosystems as strategic assets with economic and functional values?
So that's a good question, right, Todd? And, I was listening to one of your podcasts the other day, actually, and, he articulated really nicely the dependence of our food systems on the supply of phosphorus. And, if you think about it like that, right, natural capital is embedded in all of our supply chains everywhere. Once you start to understand the value that nature is making, and particularly understand the risks that are associated with losing those contributions, and those risks can be articulated in terms of the sorts of things that businesses are well aware of, cost of capital, impacts on revenue streams, impacts on costs, right? You start to get a really clear understanding of your dependencies and impacts on nature and what they mean for the longer term sustainability of your business. So, I often hear people talk about it as, we need to do conservation and we do, they're a really important part of solutions. But the core of what's going on globally at the moment, particularly around climate disclosures and nature disclosures, is really understanding how these risks impact on asset valuations and the long-term sustainability of the organisations that are managing it within our economy.
And risk management's obviously a very important part of not only, organisations like John Cotter's Northwest Phosphate, and it's not all just to do with miners or anything as such, but for leaders in business or government, how does this approach help unify environmental health with economic performance and risk management?
Well, effectively, right, at the moment, we're not considering any of these risks. Okay. And so there's a blind spot in the way that we're doing risk management, because we're not seeing the loss of nature as a material risk to a business. So by starting to use the tools and resources that organizations already have and starting to make those inputs and the value of those inputs way more visible, you can start to really assess how material this is to your longer term sustainability. And so that becomes important, right? Because even under existing accounting standards and things like that, organizations have an obligation to report to their shareholders, stakeholders, etc., issues that are of material importance to the ongoing future of these businesses. And historically, that's all been focused on financial materiality. But what we're seeing, particularly with climate disclosures and more recently the nature-related disclosures, is these are do have the potential to have material impacts on the long-term financial viability of these organizations, and stakeholders need to know about that. And so investors are starting to ask questions around what is the value of assets at risk here? What's the value of the likely impacts on revenue streams or likely impacts on cost of production and things like that? Because, they can start to make decisions around, are you a good investment or not? So, it's more than a conservation argument. It's real term. How do we shift the economy to a more sustainable footing and, using the tools that drive the economy at the moment as it is?
And mate, it's not just here in Australia. When I put you put your thinking cap, well, how's that really going to affect us here in Australia? But the broader Indo-Pacific, like Papua New Guinea, as a really good example, India, Nauru, where Nauru especially, they had a phosphate mine up there. They've mined the hell out of it. It's gone. their natural capital's gone. The only thing that was earning the island money, gone. So the value of those assets, the wharf, so everything that was digging stuff out of the ground, there's nothing left there from a commercial point of view for the shareholders either, but let alone the people living there who are earning a living out of a mine such as that.
Yeah.
It's crazy. I'd never really thought about it, but you've really shed a light on that.
I mean, these are real, they're not esoteric risks.
Yeah.
They're real. And, as you pointed out, right, there are existing precedents and they can have genuine impacts on not just organizations, but society more broadly. Right? And the East Timor example is a really good one.
Mm-hmm.
So actually, it's a really good point, right? So what you're saying is there's a recognition that nature's a finite resource. We've known for a long time that we're exceeding the planet's capacity to supply the resources that we rely on. There can only be one outcome of that, and that's a major shock, right? So we need to shift the dial, and we need to actually think about how we're going to manage these sort of constraints on what have historically been free and limitless resources into the future, because that will have genuine economic impacts on not just individual organizations, but on the global economy.
And mate, there must be plenty of data around supporting, these insights. So what's actually being measured and how's the information being used by decision makers? I mean, especially when you talk about shareholders and investors into large organizations who want to see a return on their investment.
I think this is one of the great challenges at the moment, because there's a perception out there that this isn't, nature is an incredibly complex thing to measure. And in general, it actually is, right? But there has been a consensus emerge particularly over the last 5 years, but it has been around for a lot longer, right? And so what we really need to understand is what is the state of nature. So, and you can measure that in terms of stocks or extents of particular ecosystem or resources. What's the quality of those assets? What's the condition of those ecosystems or the grade of the ore that you're extracting and things like that? And more importantly, to actually understand how do you value that is what are the flows of goods and services that are coming from nature. And at that point, you can start to use existing economic models, just discounted cash flow type models to put a value on those goods and services and start to get an estimate of the value of the assets. We're also being asked to measure, what are our impacts? Okay, so what are the outputs back into the environment? So things like pollution, our emissions to the atmosphere. What are we doing? How are our operations impacting the spread of invasive species? How does our resource use impact on the value of these underlying assets? And, what does land use change or ocean use change mean for biodiversity? So, there really is, at a high level, there's probably half a dozen or so key indicators. I mean, obviously you can break them down because you start thinking about, what's metrics by particular asset types or by particular pollutant types and things like that. Ideally, what we have seen, and particularly through things like the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, is a lot more consensus on what we need to measure, and then how we might take those measures and then start to consider them from a risk perspective in terms of impacts on asset value, impacts on revenue, impacts on cost and things like that. So I think we're heading in the right direction. We still have a little way to go in terms of particularly that quantification of some of these impacts and dependencies and the associated risks to those drivers of business performance.
That's interesting. Mate, you're not sugarcoating this, but you're a well-respected global expert on this. You travel around the world regularly speaking on high-stakes panels. You would have seen what best practice looks like at the moment globally and in Australia. Are there any good examples that, where natural capital accounting is being applied successfully in policy, investment or operations that you've seen?
So, in my world, in Tasmania down here, there's a really good example of a set of natural capital accounts that came to a company called Foraco. They've captured the attention of the globe, without a doubt, right? One of the first sort of corporate attempts at putting those financial statements, that format of financial statements, balance sheet, profit and loss statement, etc. In a way that kind of provides a North Star. BHP had done pilots on natural capital accounts as well, on assets to understand how their life of mine, what their impacts and dependencies have been on nature, and again, using similar sort of concepts around constructs of balance sheets, etc. So there's a very famous example from Kering. Kering is one of the sort of global brand houses, the sort of boutique brands that sit underneath. They're the pioneer of this concept, environmental profit and loss statements. So it has emerged. I think it's really starting to pick up in momentum now, particularly on the back of initiatives like the Capitals Coalition internationally, the things like the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, who are working with the International Financial Reporting Standards to incorporate this disclosure regime into existing corporate disclosure requirements. So it is starting, those examples are starting to emerge more rapidly. And, you're getting to one of the core challenges that we as an organisation face is how do we serve up information that is timely and credible and decision useful in a way that's cost effective, that can be applied broadly across the economy is probably what keeps me up most nights. I don't want to come across as being kind of pessimistic. This is I think we're at a point in history that's a real opportunity to transition to a more just and sustainable future, right? And we're starting to step into this mindset of, or how do we do things better, right? And how do we do things more sustainably? And there are lots of opportunities to shift the way that we're doing things and to transition to new business models that will create significant opportunities for people to, for organisations, and particularly the early adopters in all of this work.
Mate, well, one thing that I sort of think about is that, especially the last 15 years where, there's a lot of imposts on businesses to report and implement new policies and procedures of how to do things, to appease the minority, so to speak. Is this another, the last thing you want, because this is a finite resource we're dealing with, right? The globe, those coal mines don't just keep, filling up like a self-licking ice cream all the time. How do you, I guess, combat the challenge of people thinking, oh, this is just more bloody greenwashing, or we've just got to, we're just here to appease the board of a large company, or shareholders who say that they want to see this happening. How do you get around that?
Yeah, it is a challenge. Okay. And, there is a mindset that this is just increasing compliance, and, and increasing compliance comes with increased costs and things like that. I might have to write contracts and start to supply a whole range of information that we would never have to have done just to cross procurement hurdles. So it can be, I can understand why people think this is a compliance problem, but I think you're missing the point. I think we missed the opportunity. And that's why I really think it needs to be framed as risk. It does take organizations to really sit down and think about what are the risks for me, right? And from that understanding come the strategies and the opportunities to address those risks. And what we actually want here is not increased compliance. Compliance is going to play a really important role because it's going to be the thing that makes everyone get on board, right? But if you treat it as a compliance exercise, you're missing the opportunity to think about the opportunities likely to flow from changing processes, generating new revenue streams, all of that sort of thinking. It really needs to be considered from a strategic lens, not a compliance lens.
Yeah, that's a great point. That's a really good point, mate. So there's an opportunity for first mover advantage almost, even though it's been around for a while, but you don't hear too many companies doing this. So there could be a good opportunity here.
Yeah, there definitely will be. And I think it's really important that we support, particularly in the early phases where there's a lot of uncertainty, that we support these organizations to do this. And to some extent, it's a risky enterprise in itself, right? You touched on the concept of greenwashing just before, right? Organizations generally are pretty scared of being accused of being, of greenwashing here, right? So there is still a lot of uncertainty around how to measure some of these things or what these measurements mean. So it's really important that we give organizations the room to actually take this on and do it in a relatively safe way so that they can't be accused of greenwashing. Because the alternative to that is green hushing, right? So organizations don't disclose what's going on, more importantly. And, as we sort of talked about before, understanding those impacts and dependencies and the risks that are associated with those is actually a financially material piece of knowledge that needs to be out there. The whole, it's incredibly important for those flows of capital that are so important to the economy, that they're flowing into practices, businesses, areas that confident you're going to be able to get a return on investment.
Yeah, that's a really important point, mate. So Tones, what are the practical applications for sectors like, defence, agribusiness, logistics, infrastructure across the Indo-Pacific, so critical infrastructure, critical industries? Yeah, particularly in regions where ecological stability underpins national resilience.
Yeah, that's a really good point, right? And again, you can come back to
Nauru
example, right? Like there's a company, a country, depleted a resource to a point where they can fundamentally the economy of that nation and the health and well-being of those people, right? And so where do those people go? You can think about, particularly around that equatorial belt, that there's a future there that can potentially be uninhabited. And so where do all those people go? Against a context of rising sea level heat, are we going to see mass migration, right? So you can start thinking through, wow, that has defense implications as resources become more constrained, they're more or there's more immigration. Potentially it can have quite significant impacts on that sort of geopolitical environment for the next couple of decades in particular. So yeah, we touched on food security, right? As nature is less able to provide those goods and services that we've always taken for granted, the fertilization, the pollination, etc., we're going to have to put more inputs into the system to feed our people. Or the alternative, the supply chain of food starts to get more fractured and disrupted through time. So I think there are quite significant risks involved for us, and governments need to be cognizant of that. As a society, we just need to start tackling this problem.
I reckon it's quite probable that in the future there'll be wars fought over food and water security. And I don't think it's that far off. You look at, Africa as an example, constant drought. Japan, for the first time in God knows how long, are now having to have rice auctions because they've run out of rice. China's in the same boat. 40% of the country's in drought. What happens when you can't feed 1.2 billion people? There's uprising.
There are historical precedents to these sorts of things as well, right? Conflict has often been around access to resources, things like that. So, it does have genuine defense implications. And, as you talk about the stability of our region as well. So it's, I hope it doesn't get that bad, and I hope we can shift the boat. And the important thing in all of this, we have solutions ready to go, right? We know how to fix a lot of these problems. It does political will, it takes will from businesses, it takes will from society. There is a lot of focus on how business can respond. This needs systematic change right from the tops of governments to individuals. And it shouldn't all be on businesses, right? We all have a responsibility here.
Yeah, that's a really good point. That's a very good point. So, mate, if I'm leading a company or a regional program or even government, what's the first step in applying natural capital thinking to planning or reporting?
If I was running a business rightly, there are two things I would do immediately, which aren't going to cause you too much grief, right? I would ensure that my governance structure is seriously climate and risk, and more broadly, risks associated with rising inequality, technological risks. So really start to build up the capabilities within your organizations, that broader spectrum of risk, putting in place those structures that information is getting up into board level decision making and in front of boards, and that's not a hard thing to do, right? Like it could just be a case expanding the scope of existing subcommittees or creating new subcommittees with key responsibilities around seriously addressing the impacts and dependencies that particular organization has on. And then, beyond that, then you can start to put in place the measurement programs to actually monitor those risks, making sure you're collecting the right data to actually put valuations on some of these so you can really assess the materiality of that. So if you look at the disclosure regime that's coming through, and most Australian, a lot of Australians are already signed on to the climate related disclosures. It's built around 4 pillars: governance, risk management, strategy, and metrics and targets, right? So I think three of those 4 pillars, the governance, the risk management, and the strategy, they can be done now, straight away. You can start putting in place the processes to do them, and from them will flow the imperative to start getting out, deciding what to measure, how to measure, and what those measurements mean more broadly.
And businesses do it every day with other inputs into their business, so it's not much of a change, is it?
I don't think it is a big change, right? It's an expansion of scope. And, one thing I do hear a lot is, we're too busy dealing with climate. And I'm like, well, climate's part of nature, right? It's not, the nature thing is as important. The rising inequality is as important. The technological changes that we're seeing is as important, right? Like start to think more systematically around this, because we're not asking for major changes in structure. We're just really asking for a change in the way what risks we assess and how we assess them.
And I guess that's what boards...
It's not a changing process at all, right? Like, as you said, organizations are already doing this with health and safety, with all sorts of things, right? So
Yeah, and that's sort of the way boards should be thinking, right? Not what's now, what's next, but what's after that. And especially if you're talking about patient capital with large programs that, people generally think, consume nature. And again, as you said earlier, this isn't all just about, mining companies or infrastructure companies. It's about every business that, potentially could use this to their advantage.
And the system is setting itself up for every business to be engaged, right? There will be broad uptake of this type of thinking. Probably in the next decade. I'm hoping most of this is mainstreamed within 5 years. But there is a lot of momentum right now, and it is really kicking on. So it is a issue for, as you say, to start thinking about and dealing with.
Yeah, and mate, because that was one thing I was going to ask. What's the next 5 to 10 years look like? And I think you've hit that on the head there. But I guess what do businesses need to do to become, nature capital?
Start to think about, well, what are those risks that you're exposed to? What start to think about how do you assess the materiality of those risks to your organization, and then you can start to think about what sort of strategies or transitions that you need to put in place. But I think the first step there is I can understand why organizations can be overwhelmed by this. There needs that capability in all of this. This isn't the remit of the sustainability team. This is in many respects, this will be most successful when this is the remit of the chief financial officer, and it's driven by the CFO, and that we're integrating this thinking across the whole organization.
Yeah, I wonder if in a few years to come, mate, we'll see KPIs of boards and CEOs include something around natural capital. We've seen it with other bits and pieces, health and safety, but also equality and other bits and pieces. It'll be interesting to see.
Oh, I hope so, and I think it's going to be one of the really important ways that we can start to mainstream this thinking, right? If you've got key performance indicators around some of this, and it is coming, right? I'm pretty confident that that'll be one of the key drivers for that main type of activity. There are clear lines of responsibility and implication, positively or negatively, for not meeting those performance indicators.
Yeah. So Tones, finally, mate, if you could leave one message with leaders across the Indo-Pacific, what should they take away from this conversation today?
Hopefully it's a story of, I think we're at a transition point where we need to take these into account and then start to plan how we're going to adapt to these. I mean, effectively, they're just resource constraints, and we need to be prepared for that. So, I would encourage people not to be despondent and it's all too big, because it's actually not that difficult. It's not a massive change to the way they already do business. There's a little bit of work in increasing your capability and your awareness and understanding the importance of that. But, I don't see major changes to the way, the governance structures and things like that. So just get on board, learn.
Jump on the O'Grady Express.
Yeah. The nature trains left the station, right? So it's time to get on board, right?
So mate, is this something that CSIRO help businesses with, or is it more left to consultants to, for businesses to engage consultants to get their head around how to do this?
We've been working quite closely with businesses in CSIRO, and there are a number of people out in the world doing this. It's not just CSIRO, obviously, but this is a global effort. And CSIRO has an important role to play, right? Because, particularly in the work that we've been doing is trying to reduce confusion, give organizations really clear guidelines on how to start to tackle this. We've produced something, a shameless plug here, Todd, the Natural Capital Handbook, right? It's designed to cut through the sort of the noise and confusion that sits around all of this natural capital accounting, and I think the other role that CSIRO can play is really starting to fill the research gaps in terms of where we know we have knowledge gaps, particularly in relation to particular services or ecosystem functions, and that is the role that CSIRO can play. We can start to develop the sort of input data sets that people can use, so that everyone's singing off the same play sheet. Again, I think R&D has a really important role in driving consistency in how these things get measured and how things are done, and also in bringing down the cost of these sort of data products, because it is a spatially explicit and data intensive process, right? On the consultant thing, I'm 100% sure consultants are busting to get in on. My opinion on that has always been, and probably a little bit controversial, so apologies to any consultants, right? I really feel that doing this in-house will maximize the value. So, even from my own experience, I've handed over sets of accounts and to the sort of great, they look great. What do we do with these? Right? You've got to sort of have gone through that journey of understanding why it's important and why this information is of value to you. So, I mean, I suppose the analog is, do you hand over your management accounts to a consultant?
Yeah, good point. But I mean, some businesses won't know where to start, right?
No, and a lot of businesses won't know where to start, and I think consultants can definitely help at that point. But and again, I suppose part of our role is also providing that sort of baseline information on concepts and trying to make it accessible to people that aren't necessarily environmentalists or whatever, right? But,
yeah.
But I think the thing that I often reflect on, right? At my heart, I'm an environmental scientist. I'm a plant scientist, but this is actually an economic problem. It's a financial problem, right? So there's a lot of capability that already exists within organizations that can tackle these problems. It's just a broader set of considerations. So we need to get people working together to actually cross these language barriers and make sure that people can actually understand.
So, mate, you've hit some wonderful points there, mate. Hey, Tones, I really appreciate your time today, buddy. It has been really insightful for me. I've learned a lot. And hopefully the 3.5 listeners that we get every week have learned a lot as well. That's, but mate, I'd love to catch up with you again in the near future to keep talking about this important matter.
Yeah, thanks heaps, Todd. Thanks for the opportunity. And mate, I always love catching up with you. So it's hopefully that was helpful.
That's it for this episode of the VAXA Bureau Intelligence Optimised podcast. If you found value here, subscribe, rate the show, and share it with someone building the future of critical industry. The path of leadership may be solitary, but the future of leadership is coactive intelligence. Be ready for today, be prepared for tomorrow.